Good afternoon, or perhaps morning or evening, wherever you are. And thank you for joining us today when the time zones and geographic boundaries become one at least for the next hour. As Director of Strategy at Resilience First, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar organised by Resilience First in conjunction with PwC. And thank you very much, PwC. Resilience First mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. Please do visit our website, resiliencefirst.co.uk, to see the many projects and events we organise in an effort to help your understanding and application of resilience. Today's webinar is centred on the theme of improving urban infrastructure for better resilience and through a global perspective. This is a timely and increasingly relevant topic to introduce as we begin 2022. At a recent conference and masterclass on building resilient infrastructure, which featured the UN's Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the University College London and the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, a new acronym was proposed in this space. And appropriately, it's called or uses the word SPACES. And this stands for S for sharing, P for protecting, A for adapting, C for continuous learning, E for environmental concerns, and S for socially engaging. SPACES. Now, I hope that today, even if you don't use the SPACES acronym, then many of the ideas expressed in that acronym will be revealed in the next hour. We have been fortunate to have brought together 3 expert speakers who will reflect their understanding of SPACES from the 3 very different regions and cities, namely Dubai, Cape Town, and Los Angeles. I'm sure each will give you a flavour, albeit brief, of the ways they see urban change and resilience taking place and taking hold. I'll shortly invite Peter Hall, the Vice President and Global Director of Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure at Wood plc, and no relation, by the way, to begin proceedings. Wood, as an organisation, is an ambassador of Resilience First, so is well placed to lead the discussions today. After some opening remarks, Peter will then introduce our 3 speakers. You should have their biographies in your joining instructions. So in the interest of time, I hope you will read their impressive records at your leisure. Throughout the session, I encourage all of you listening to ask questions of the speakers by posting brief questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. You can do this at any time and really do encourage you to engage with those speakers. And I'm sure the chair will include as many as he can when we come to the Q&A session towards the end of the hour. Lastly, I should add that the proceedings are being recorded and we will share an edited summary as well as the slides used in the next few days. So with that, without further ado, Peter, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. And if you could put up those slides, it's really a privilege to be here. We've got some amazing speakers. And as Robert said, what we really want to do is look at resilience and how it's being addressed in different regions and some of the common challenges and some of the unique solutions. I thought as a quick overview, just to get into this, a lot of this work improving urban resilience and infrastructure and improving resilience comes out of a lot of what we talked about just at COP26. And I think this really frames a lot of what we're going to talk about today. I thought this was interesting. It's the idea that resilience is global. I mean, we have to solve this globally. And right now, things are changing so quickly, we have to act now. And I think a lot of these will be talked about by our speakers. The idea that climate resilience and mitigation go hand in hand. So it's the idea that as we push towards net zero solutions, we also have to do that in a resilient way so they don't fail and they can benefit people. the idea that nature and biodiversity plays a key part in improving urban infrastructure. So these are some of the key themes at COP26, and you'll see how they're really going to be promoted in this year in the lead up to next year. And addressing the climate finance gap, that's a big part of, how do we improve infrastructure? And I thought this was a really interesting, resilience works best when it's locally led. So we can bring solutions to these urban environments, but being locally led is what's important. The next slide. And I thought what the key themes, this is for the climate champions, that was really going to drive this work globally, is the intersection of race to zero, so decarbonization, race to resilience, and then financing. And then the next slide, it really highlights the idea that these are the key impacts we're trying to address. Flooding, drought, heat are the big three. And you look at, 3.5 billion people exposed globally who are not the least resilient and also the least responsible. And then the next slide really highlights what globally are some of the themes for the next COP. So the next big global summit and all the events leading up to it this year through 2030 for next year. And it's great to have Richard on the call today, who I'm sure this will be welcome to see the theme. But it's going to be a whole of Africa COP in Cairo. But the focus areas are going to be around adaptation. So how do we get adaptation and resilience on the same level as mitigation, really addressing loss and damage? How can we mobilize more finance to build urban resilient infrastructure? And then how can we really leverage and accelerate nature-based solutions, which are a big part of how we build urban infrastructure as well. So the next slide. Yeah, and just in brief, these are I think this is the idea that what we do around resilience has to be solutions orientated. It has to inspire. It's the whole idea of what we do has to really strengthen and mainstream resilience. So these are some of the initiatives that are front and center for where we need to go and what we need to drive towards, mobilizing finance and then accelerating systems transformation. I think you'll see some great examples in the talks today on this. And then the last slide here, just as a way to finish. For our organization, as many do, it's all about analyzing climate data, understanding risks, then protecting assets. So you have assets that either protect against climate or they protect for the people that could be impacted from climate shock. So it's the idea you build assets, you build urban infrastructure that's tied to future climate risks. It's a very people-centered approach to building those assets, so that the people that rely on urban infrastructure in any region can depend on those services and improve their lives and livelihoods. So it's kind of a framework linking shocks and climate shocks and stresses into infrastructure. And then when we do that, it can transform companies, most importantly, people and their livelihoods. And there's a lot of factors now around climate risk disclosures and things that are really driving this to get a resilience dividend. So with that, I want to turn it over, and we have three, great speakers. Nayaz Mohammed, who's a partner Middle East practice for PwC in Dubai, and then following him will be Richard Palmer, Director of Global Sustainability at Integral Group, based in Cape Town, and then Heather Rosenberg, Associate Principal in the Americas for ERA, and also founder of the Building Resilience Network. So I'll turn it over to you, to Nayaz, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Robert, for this opportunity. So I'm going to talk for the next 6 to 8 minutes on urban resilience, which really is about how do you protect urban infrastructure and make it sustainable. And this topic has become more important of late, primarily due to the two factors, I would say. The first one being the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. It has put in a lot of strain on the cities, on the urban infrastructure, impact on economic infrastructure, health, social, and other infrastructure. So that's one trigger for the resilience from an urban infrastructure perspective becoming more and more important. The second one being there's an increased exposure to the natural and man-made hazards in the past few years as compared to the past many years before. And that's it's going to increase more going forward due to climate change related matters, which Peter talked about, and also due to rapid urbanization. So all these factors have really put in a lot of strain on the city's infrastructure and their ability to handle the disruptions disruptions that they incur. And that's something that they realized, unfortunately, since the pandemic came on. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So this one talks about the urbanization, which is becoming a trend in the region, globally, and more so in the Middle East region. I'm going to talk a global view as well as the perspective from the Middle East. So if you look at it, the urbanization has increased considerably. Currently, there is about 55% of the global population lives in cities, which is not a small number. 55% of the global population is based in cities, and going forward by 2050, in the next 28 years, it's not going to reduce; it's going to increase to 68%. Okay, so that's a significant, close to 70% of the population will be living in cities, and this will put a lot of strain on the city, and really are the city's management, if I may call it, or the powers that be, are they ready to handle this current growth as well as the future expected growth? In the MENA region, in the Middle East, North Africa region, the urban population has increased 4 times between the 1970 and 2010 in the previous 30-40 years. So there's a considerably increased trend to move towards the urban locations for the people. And cities are actually a haven, and also they have they increase the economic development, innovation, and growth, and they generate a lot of that opportunities. So almost 80% of the global GDP, which is again not a small number, comes from the contribution from the cities, really. So that's really there's a huge amount of concentration that is there. Now, there is, because of this increase in, I would say, concentration in the cities, it comes along with it a series of risks. Okay, 2 of them are, you can see in the slide. 70% of the gas emissions and global waste are produced by urban areas, and 60% of the global energy consumption are accounted for by the cities. And also because of this, the cities that are fast growing are particularly at risk in relating to flooding, air pollution, crime, and also they have highly concentrated poverty and unemployment, income disparity, overcrowding, water scarcity. There are quite a lot of these risks that are currently being faced by these cities, and therefore it's really important for the management of the cities to kind of look at resilience in much more I would say in much more deeper manner than what they're doing currently. On top of that, if you look at the right hand side of the slide, there are the hazards are growing, and as I said before, the world is becoming more and more prone to hazards. And there's a statistic that in the last 20 years, 2000 to 2019, there are around 7,000 plus natural disasters that happened globally, and these claimed around 1.2 million lives, and about 235 million people were displaced. This has been a significant impact due to this growth in the hazards globally as well. By the way, these statistics that I'm taking are from a study which PwC Strategy and did for one of the government global events in 2021. In the Middle East, North Africa region, the number of natural disasters tripled by 2014 as compared to 1980s level, affecting over 40 million people, and about $20 billion of cost was spent on that. In addition to that, due to the climate change reason, most of the world's urban areas are, as are situated on coastlines, and this increases their exposure to impacts such as rising sea levels caused by global warming, and in cities in the Middle East, such as or countries in Bahrain, Egypt, Kuwait, and UAE on the coastal side, they have a impact of the rising temperature and the global warming. In fact, there is a statistic that with 1% or 1 centigrade increase in the temperature, that leads to around 8% drop in the GDP in the region, in the Middle East. And this percentage drop, for every 1% increase in temperature, the highest percentage drop is in the Middle East as compared to other global places. So this is something that also something to consider for the cities management, if I can call. In addition to that, there is a human hazards, which have an effect on, for example, crime, cybercrime, geopolitical conflicts, industrial incidents, etc. And that also has an impact. And in the Middle East perspective, the effect of violence has increased, equal to 28% of the region's GDP. And also, as compared to cyber attacks, there has been an increase in the cyber attacks. 18% of the Middle East companies have suffered more than 5,000 attacks as compared to global average of 9%, etc. So the point is, there is an increase in urbanization, and this itself poses risks to the people, and the cities should take care of that and build in resilience measures. If you can go to the next slide, please. Now, what do they need to do? I mean, this is something they need to consider in terms of what is the cost-benefit analysis of urban resilience. And there is an interesting statistic that for every $1 invested in the building the resilience infrastructure relating to natural disaster, this yields around $4 in return. So that's a study conducted by the World Bank, which basically demonstrates that if you invest the right amount of funds for building resilience infrastructure or in planning for resilience, the returns that you generate from that is considerable. And similarly, as you know, in the EU's Clean Air program, the target for reduction is 8.5 billion euro as compared to 16.5 over the past few years. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so from the Middle East perspective, what has been the impact, and this is the last slide, is most of the cities are at risk of not being able to secure emergency care and affordable housing for the citizens. So there was a study done on the Middle East cities as compared to the other well-developed cities such as London, New York, and other Singapore and other developed cities. As compared to that, in the Middle East, many of the cities are at risk of not being able to provide secure emergency care services and affordable housing to the citizens. In terms of the cities in the Middle East have low levels of cohesion, inclusion, and social protection, and that's a risk, and that needs to be managed. The public finances are weak, especially of late because of the economic situation, and the debt burden has increased considerably, and the innovation is not fully developed. And this is, I'm not talking particularly about Dubai as a city. I'm talking about Middle East as a region. Middle East as a region has about 10 plus countries and quite a few cities. And broadly, while Dubai and Abu Dhabi and certain other cities like Riyadh are reasonably well developed, but the other cities are not caught up as much as they should. MENA cities have responded. They should respond by developing resilience blueprints to build the institutional capacities that can help them reduce exposure to threats and minimize vulnerability. So there is a need for a concerted effort to build in planned initiatives around that. And finally, they should build transformative capacities which will allow them to innovate and advance economically and technologically growth, thus preventing or minimizing the effects of future crises. So these are some of the perspectives that we see in the Middle East cities as compared to the rest of the world on this. So with this, I stop here and now pass on to Richard to provide you an overview from his perspective. Richard, over to you.
Naz, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Hello from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm going to speak from a little bit more of a personal perspective because I've had probably more direct run-ins with issues of resilience significance over the last few years than you might like to count. Right now, I'm speaking to you from a city that's, probably best known for Table Mountain, if we're honest, but after that, as the first global city that came within an absolute hair's breadth of running out of water. In 2018, Cape Town had to manage a water crisis that was the result of 3 consecutive dry winters. The city had to implement immense water restrictions. The people of Cape Town responded incredibly and halved their water consumption across the metro. And over the autumn, so Cape Town gets its rain in winter. Over the autumn of 2018, things got particularly dire. And it was really only through an intercatchment transfer where some of the farmers that had private water held in some of the mountain regions around Cape Town made a release of water into the public catchment infrastructure that Cape Town was actually able to not hit day zero. And day zero was the point where they switch off the taps and citizens go with buckets to water distribution points. That's a pretty confronting issue. And I think there's certainly lessons in there. The only things I wanted to mention from that, though, one is the intersection of agriculture and urban water management. And we would do very well to think systemically about water, not just in terms of demand reduction. And the second thing is really one of statistics. Those 3 consecutive winters were each 1 in 500 year events. They were so low on the probability that we would never have planned for them. No designer would have thought that you would get 3 consecutive winters that dry. But that's the future in front of all of us. What is coming is statistically unknown. The climate ahead of us is fundamentally different to the climate behind us and the basis for our design. Now, I don't only have Cape Town to speak about because I've also recently relocated from Sydney, Australia. And I was fortunate. I mean, we've spoken about COVID for a long time, but just before COVID, Sydney was dealing with its worst bushfires in history. We sat for, I think, about 8 weeks, where every morning the sun would rise through a dirty yellow sky and you'd cough your way to the bus stop. You couldn't see the Opera House from the Harbour Bridge as you crossed the Harbour Bridge going into the office every day. And that had a profound effect on, I would say, the psyche of Australians, certainly of Sydney-siders. It was a community weight and something that was unlike anything I've gone through, in all honesty. But the story I'd like to tell here is really the difference between the primary impacts and the secondary impacts of the sorts of climate events that we're likely to see. Now, if you were in any of the fire-affected areas, if you were at the fire front of a 80-kilometer-an-hour wind with a 70-meter wall of fire in front of you, the only thing you can do is flee. And the only thing you can do is flee early. There is nothing that we can do from a design perspective or from a property protection perspective, or indeed from a life preservation perspective, to deal with the scale of event that those fires were in their local impacted areas. But then we had the knock-on effects in terms of air quality, in terms of health outcomes, in terms of respiratory health. And those issues affected many, many more people. But there were design things we could do. Buildings that had excellent filtration managed to control their air quality much better. And as well as sort of transport links and the ability for the city to continue to function. Obviously, when visibility goes down, things become challenging. So having a diversity of transport options was much better than having only car-based transport options where you might have had worse congestion. So that was a real lesson. But then what was also interesting was the juxtaposition of going straight from the bushfire crisis into the COVID crisis. And we went from a design perspective working on projects that spanned from before November 19 and then into 2020, where we started with a design priority of resilience to manage bushfire smoke risk. So we were talking about sealing buildings up, extra filtration, no natural ventilation. And then suddenly, within the lifespan of the same project, we had to deal with the challenges of COVID, which was open everything up, extra ventilation, large airflows. And so we had the experience in real time of trying to grapple with these contrasting and conflicting needs for resilience. And I think that's a pattern that we're going to see, which is that our our endeavors around resilience don't all point in the same direction, and we have to make trade-offs or get incredibly creative. The final thing I'll say is just also speaking about having made this transition from Australia to South Africa in a time of COVID and seeing two very different cultural responses to essentially the same challenge. The first thing I would say is that being a rich country goes a hell of a long way. When you have deep financial resources, a AAA credit rating, I think the Australian government dropped about $250 billion in COVID stimulus, and that kept the economy running. It allowed them to lock down. Whether or not they should have locked down for as long as they did is another question. But the flip side of that was that there was a heightened social anxiety in Australia that really affected me. Like I noticed the levels of fear that existed within the community. Returning to South Africa in the context of COVID, much fewer financial resources. And so the economic ramifications of the pandemic have been much bigger: unemployment, poverty, and the like. But there is a social cohesion here and a sense of, I think, having faced perhaps even much bigger challenges as a community, faced the challenges of the end of apartheid and some of the things we've been dealing with since then, that meant that the perception, the fear-like perception of navigating this pandemic has actually been much lower. So I'm going to leave you with those perspectives. The importance of infrastructure in water and innovative infrastructure that it understands systemic issues between urban and regional systems. In terms of heat and fire, the key distinction between almost the insurmountability of being at the coalface of a climate event, but also the importance then of the secondary knock-on effects of that event. The tension between different sorts of resilience and how they might not all point in the same direction. And then ultimately the socioeconomic aspects of resilience that help us respond to these events in different sorts of ways. And they can also be counterintuitive. So on that note, I thank you for your attention. I look forward to some questions, and I'll hand over to Heather, Heather Rosenberg of Arup in Los Angeles. Heather, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here today. And that was really great kind of context for some of the questions that I've been thinking about and working on lately, which really have to do with energy. So the first thing I want to say is how important, and you heard this in the stories before, but I just want to stress how important the a systems perspective is, because as we start to talk about resilience, as we see these disruptions happening at different scales across different systems, we start to see how everything is connected. And a lot of the work we've been doing in Los Angeles and across California lately has been on energy systems and how do we transition our energy system towards decarbonization. And a lot of the focus around the energy conversation is around greenhouse gas mitigation, moving to all renewables. And that's an absolutely critical path that we need to be taking. California is committed to 50% renewables on the grid by 2030 and 100% by 2050. We're already, I think, more than 25%. And that's really shifting the way that energy is generated, distributed, when it's available, and actually has caused some unintended consequences where we have times where we have so much solar energy actually being generated in California that we're giving it away for free, or in some cases paying other states to take it, because if we keep it on the grid will be damaged. And so we need to be shifted towards demand management, towards solar, towards storage and batteries and other kinds of storage and all sorts of other things. So big change happening just from that. At the same time, we have to remember that this is a linear infrastructure above ground mostly and exposed to fires, and in fact has been the cause of some of California's big fires. And I really was resonating hearing Richard's story about the smoky air. My daughter has asthma. We definitely experience it here across California. As we move into this world, we have an energy system that is exposed and already experiencing power outages proactively as the system gets shut down to prevent fires in windy, hot, dry, windy conditions. We have public safety power shutoffs. So our system is disrupted. And then it's also an aging infrastructure that requires investment. The energy system is not just the infrastructure. It goes all the way from generation across the transmission and distribution systems and into buildings. And how we think about getting to renewables we need to think across all of those dimensions. If we're going to get to 100% renewables by 2050, that means removing natural gas from buildings. And it turns out that there are a lot of great benefits of doing that, because guess what? Having natural gas, having a flammable gas in your home is not actually so good for air quality. So a lot of research coming out about the health benefits of moving in that direction. So in terms of, thinking about the energy system, we have a lot of different forces of change. And what cities are starting to do is respond by setting policies to move different parts of that system towards the various goals. And the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of the major environmental groups in the US, came to us and said, okay, we're working with cities to support decarbonization. We're looking at a policy with the city of Los Angeles. Help us think about what's the right way to address affordable housing in that context. And that's a really interesting question, because we, first of all, in California, maybe even famously, have a housing shortage. We have a homelessness crisis. We don't have very much social housing. Housing is all private sector. We have very little government owned and operated housing. We don't have any housing guarantees. And we realized pretty quickly, when thinking from a resilience perspective, that when we think about energy transition, we have to understand what is the impact on the bottom of the market, on how people in their homes. Housing prices are increasing very quickly. Rents are going up very quickly. And all of that was exacerbated by COVID. So we participated and supported a pretty extensive stakeholder engagement and research initiative to understand what is the affordable housing market. And this is probably the most poorly understood and under-resourced sector in a lot of ways of our system, of our cities, of our economy. Affordable housing in Los Angeles or in California and in the United States generally has a whole bunch of different funding and financing mechanisms, but they create very complicated capital stacks. To even make an improvement, to even accept a grant, it's like having to get approval from 4, 5, 6, 7 different mortgage lenders, and it becomes prohibitive. At the same time, the benefits of home ownership, of improving the value of your home, not only don't necessarily help renters, but can increase their rent, increase their any changes in their electricity bill, any of that can actually have a net increase in household expenses and trigger displacement. So from a resilience perspective, having safe and reliable, affordable housing is sort of like the bowl that everything sits in. And if you have a strong threat of displacement, it's like your bowl becomes a sieve. And when you think about what's the worst case of climate change, what does it look like? It doesn't look all that different from people living on the streets in Skid Row. So how can we address this preservation of existing affordable housing at the same time as promoting decarbonization and promoting this transition across our energy infrastructure? And it turns out we really need to look at these systems in tandem. And that systems-based approach really shifts what your answers look like. If your question is only how do we decarbonize California as quickly as possible, you will go down certain paths that will have unintended consequences and leave people behind, and in fact have left people behind. We have a chronic condition or pattern of disinvestment in particular communities as a result of racist land use practices and all sorts of other things, and making investment decisions based on property value, that undermines the ability to invest in communities that are actually on the front lines of climate change. So by looking at these things together, we are seeing that if we look at preservation of affordable housing, keeping housing fit for purpose, and decarbonization as a system of goals that need to be met together, we actually can open up the doors for much more creative and holistic approaches that better meet this community that is in crisis. And I'm not just talking about the renters, I'm talking about the owners as well. So we can design programs that, for example, are one-stop shop, creating simplified pathways for these capital stacks to flow, bundling both the financing and funding, as well as the technology and services that are being provided, technical support, all sorts of other things through accelerator programs. And we are working on designing how can those things work together to actually move and support bottom-up market transformation. These are buildings that might otherwise never decarbonize if they aren't aggressively supported. And so we can look at that system and really move the market in some very creative ways that have value for the energy system, for the public, for those most vulnerable members of our population. So that's what I want to share is really that systems-based approach and how that really can reveal much more creative and powerful solutions. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Heather. And great discussions and listening to these. I mean, it's interesting how housing and power in some of these areas that are just critical to building resilience, and also how a lot of the common themes around resilience, no matter what region you're in, all play out and have a big part in how we create resilient urban infrastructure. I thought, just to follow up, actually, Richard, some of your work, especially where you were in Australia and now in South Africa, but what are some of the key partnerships that you see that could really increase the impact of resilience in the region?
I think when we look at urban resilience, the importance of municipal government really does come to the fore. Yeah. In a lot of places, municipal government is quite substantially disempowered. So, we talk about Sydney, for instance. Sydney is made up of, I think, 16 to 18 different municipal governments. Through the work of a chief resilience officer, those governments have started to integrate their response. For info, when you hear about the city of Sydney, what you're hearing about is the LGA that covers the CBD of Sydney. It's not metropolitan Sydney, and there is no metropolitan authority in Sydney. Transport for New South Wales is probably the closest you get. So metropolitan level governance is critical, but cities rarely struggle with cash. Cities typically have a very limited slice of taxation income. They rely on rates. Rates typically allow them to cover operational costs, waste collection, road maintenance, etc. But cities, in terms of their capacity for big capital programs, are often substantially limited, and particularly cities in the global south. So either the levels of government speaking to each other in an integrated way and getting federal or state government funding to support urban outcomes. It's rarer than you'd think, though. I think a lot of governments have not yet really woken up to the critical importance of cities, as Naz showed us. But then obviously private capital and the role that capital can play. But the tricky thing with capital in resilience specifically is establishing a return. Capital doesn't fund the projects. So how do we fund resilience projects when what we're doing is reducing long-term risk? We're not necessarily going to see an economic bump out of these. We're not necessarily going to see a new kind of stimulation of economic activity, in many cases, we may just see an alleviation of risk. So how we fund resilience work as opposed to other sorts of urban development work, I think, is a critical question.
Yeah, perfect. And I think that leads, as I mean, one of the questions I had for you, and you know, you're just highlighting it now, actually, is the need for common definitions and a framework. So all these different agencies and partners are kind of working off the same mission. So, you know, for you, maybe just briefly, what are some of the elements in a resilience blueprint that you're seeing that are critical to enabling this work?
Yeah, I think it's important, considering the crisis, the risks that we are facing due to the infrastructure resilience shocks. It's important to address this in a more structured and concerted manner. And what I mean by that is you need to kind of have specific focus on three areas. One is the response capability to be enhanced, which is the ability to anticipate, cope with, and protect against shocks. You need to focus on the response aspect. You need to focus on the recovery aspect, because recovery is about the ability to mitigate the impact from a shock. And finally, the transformation aspect, so which is to take advantage or leverage this situation that we are in, the challenge that we are in, and see how you can relook at your fundamentals and how you can advance economically, socially, and technologically. So broadly, that's the broad theme of addressing the challenges in terms of response capabilities, recovery capabilities, and also leveraging and doing the transformation. Few areas that they need to focus on is enabling the cities to assess and mitigate the exposure to the hazards. They need to look internally and externally and see what are the various types of natural hazards and human caused hazards that are likely to that they're exposed to, and assess them and follow a typical risk-based approach in handling this situation. So assess and mitigate the exposure they have to hazards, minimize the structural weakness to limit the impact of a disaster. So they need to see what initiatives they can bring in to minimize the weakness, the structural weakness, to limit the impact of a disaster. And they should look at it in 3 or 4 areas. The first is around the basic needs which a society should have, like maintaining critical medical supplies, achieving security of food supply, access to continuous availability of water, quality of energy, etc. So look at the basic needs and the impact of that to be addressed. Impact of societal impact as well, safeguarding vulnerable populations, social protection, providing social protection for them, access to quality education. Look at the societal impact, the economic impact in terms of ensuring sustainable growth. What could be the negative impact of these risks on the economic impact? And finally, on the entire urban environment as well. So developing smart urban infrastructure, providing reliable, safe mobility and connectivity, etc. So look at assessing and mitigating exposures to hazards, minimizing the structural weaknesses to limit the impact of a disaster, and of course to institute capabilities to respond, recover, and transform from a disaster and a shock capabilities around. So they build the capacities around this. So these are some of the, I would say, elements that they need to consider when they are, to kind of prepare themselves well in advance when facing such a disruptive risk for them. I hope that answers your question.
Very perfectly. And thanks. You really highlighted a lot of areas that are critically important in this area. And actually, one of our questions coming in, and it actually it's similar to one I wanted to ask you, Heather, is the idea of making a business case for social and community resilience. And this question that came in also is, how do regions involve local residents and communities in resilience? So the whole communication part, and maybe if there's some examples of how local people can influence resilience, discussions and projects, sort of how community benefits are being incorporated. And then after you answer, maybe if Nayaz and Richard have some thoughts on that too, that'd be great.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts to that question. So let me first talk about, sort of an approach to thinking about the business case. We think pretty narrowly around business case, typically being that return on investment. And there are a number of things that complicate that. One is this notion of, risk reduction. How do you price risk reduction? How do you price risk reduction? If you're a large corporation, you can put a value on that. If you are, a low income community, if you have households that are on the verge of displacement, they're already at risk. Their systems, their capacity is stretched. It's not that they aren't resilient. It's that resilient capacity is maxed out by underlying stressors and shocks. That there is no more give in that system, and people are actually being quite creative in finding ways to survive. So when we think about how do you price risk, that's, it depends really on the user, and how do we think about that I think the government needs to probably play a role to equalize that, because reducing risk for a corporation may be to leave a particular location, which could be, an anchor employer that leaves people jobless. So it is very possible for government, for private interests to exacerbate community resilience, or to exacerbate community stressors by their economic decisions around managing risk. So we need sort of a broader societal approach to thinking about that. The other piece of that is, how do you price co-benefits? And so if we only are working on shoring things up and mitigating risk, then we end up in a situation where we will have a whole variety of unintended consequences. Because if you think narrowly, if you think linearly in this arena, you're not thinking through the potential for cascading impacts. You're not thinking through how systems are interconnected and where the potential failure points might be. If you take a more systems-based approach, you can actually quantify social benefits. And we're doing a lot of work right now on quantifying social ROI. In the case of in Los Angeles that I'm talking about, we've quantified it as a worst case scenario of displacement, and what is the cost of homelessness. Keeping people in their home has a societal return or societal benefit, and then using that to make a business case for public investment that then can be brought into a framework for public-private partnerships. In countries that have things like socialized housing, socialized medicine, some of those returns are easier to make. My colleagues in the UK have lots of data from their national public health system on all of these things that we don't have in the US, because we don't have that in our public system. So thinking about some creative ways to quantify what are those benefits, what is the cost of whether it's displacement or other social harms, health impacts that can be more straightforward. How do you bring that together into a framework? How do you not just calculate ROI based on property value? And that's what happens often if you have, classic example, property on two sides of a river that can flood, and one is high-end homes and one is low-income community, and you calculate benefit based entirely on return on investment, that more affluent community will always attract more investment because it has higher property value. You have to factor in those externalities, essentially, and to make that case, because that social return on investment of reducing risk in that low-income community is much higher. So we need a whole new way of thinking about this. I don't pretend to have the answers, but I do know that we are working towards a lot of the metrics and different ways of calculating it, and working with different parties and trying to align the right interests with those different metrics so that people make better decisions.
Yeah, perfect. And even for our work, a lot of it's like what we build for infrastructure, moving beyond just what it is as infrastructure and asset to what it does, the services, and that's becoming a huge part in this. And so one of the questions that came through, and perhaps Richard, but others.
Before you go into the next question, I just
like
to jump in.
Oh, of course, yeah.
That investment question.
Perfect.
I think there's going to be an interesting business case process that emerges for new infrastructure. And I think lots of clever people will advise on future risk and how you design for climate resilience, etc. But we've built a lot of stuff over the last couple of 100 years, or even longer, a couple of 1,000 years, and not all of it is going to come through with flying colors. And so, as we see impacts as a society, we're going to have to make choices about what we choose to rebuild, what we choose to protect, and what we choose to abandon. Now, I've become a little bit of a pessimist, particularly over the last 2 years, at our global capacity to make those sorts of decisions well. When the rubber hit the road in rich countries, they absolutely maxed out their vaccine purchase capacity, and the global south was left with relatively few in the global supply. And as a result, we saw variants emerge in South Africa and in India as a direct result of low early levels of vaccination. So the precedent that we have is that whether it's national geopolitics or whether it is inequality within places, is that rich places will protect themselves and many poor places will be left to make do. And so as we get into, we need a very much richer societal dialogue. We have to work out not what do we choose to invest in, but how do we make the decisions about investment when we fully acknowledge that some things are going to get abandoned and some things are going to get protected and some things are going to get rebuilt. And how do those impacts distribute globally? How do those impacts distribute within any country? And then how do we grapple with that? I mean, this is going to be a set of social contract issues that we face as a society. What does it mean to be a citizen of a country? What level of protection can you expect? When the third consecutive hurricane season flattens the waterfront properties on the eastern seaboard of the United States, at what point do you choose not to rebuild? I don't know the answers to those, but I think that's the solution set. That's the set of really difficult societal questions that are coming our way. How do we value human life? How do we value human prosperity in different places and the differentials between communities? Which is a social science. We need more social scientists to come into engineering.
Yeah, no, it's such a critical point. And I just was on a climate champions call today, and they talked a lot about loss and damage. So how is loss and damage going to be increased in as you said, in some of the countries that are both least responsible for the climate impacts, but most impacted? And in fact, it relates to one of the questions that came through really in a way is, so how can public sector players, so national and municipal governments, better be informed, better drive that discussion? Or maybe even a wider question is to your challenge, who's going to solve that problem? It's easy to say, public-private partnerships. Is it going to be GFANs? Is it going to be a global alliance? And I'll throw that out to everyone. Actually, that addresses a couple of the questions that came in actually too.
I mean, I'll jump in.
Sure.
So, I think we'll have to give multilateralism its due. There's been a lot of complaining about the ineffectiveness of IPCC, the COP process, and our ability to make collective decisions. I mean, I think it's bloody extraordinary that we've managed to get as far as we have in many ways, because the diversity of views and the diversity of histories is large. So I think there's a certain level of trust in multilateralism as the best tool that we currently have to solve global problems. It's not perfect, but I'm yet to see a better one. The other lesson, I guess, from here has been to have lived through the social transition out of apartheid and into a democratic space without ending up in civil war, which was no minor miracle. those sorts of transitions where societies have managed to navigate big step changes, whether it's through exceptional leadership, whether it is through reconciliation, whether it is through a combination of economics, leadership, social, and legal. I think those are the sorts of transitions we should look at and try and learn from. Because I think where we can see transitions are going to be the nature of the beast from here on in. It's going to be instability and transitions. And so working out how we transition from one state to another without falling in a heap is going to be key. And looking to how we've done it before, I think, will be important.
I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I mean, I just want to build on that and say, I think that when I think about what are the biggest hazards, I think political upheaval and descent into fascism is probably the number one biggest threat to all of these problems. So it is, we can see the pathways to solutions, whether they're technical or financing solutions. I can see the pathway. We have the smart people to figure those things out. It's the large allocation of resources and the collective sort of political will to even acknowledge that some of these things are problems to begin with that need solutions, and then we can hammer out what are the specifics. But as you move towards scarcity or even perceived scarcity, which is, I think, part of the narrative, that is actually the biggest danger.
Maybe if we can add one point here, if you don't mind. While there are so many challenges around it, but eventually it has worked in some entities, some governments, and some cities. Example being one in Finland, where they had a proactive program of kind of storing, especially during COVID, around 8 to 10 months of critical supplies of medical and other infrastructure requirements beforehand. And that was very well, taken by the public, and it was well received, and it came in quite handy during the pandemic. The other one being, countries such as, China, I would say Hong Kong, Singapore, and other in the East. They had a SARS situation before, and in 2003, if I remember. So they learned through that, and in the current pandemic situation, they kind of responded relatively better because they had the contact tracing systems in place. They had an immunization infrastructure in place. So it comes back to the leadership and the governance at the government level, and if they have the they have the vision and the inclination to do it with all the political challenges, eventually they will kind of achieve it. So back to you.
Yeah, perfect. Great discussion, and I think, Robert, we're at the top of the hour, so I'll turn it back to you. But certainly appreciate all the panelists, and great work you're doing, and great discussion and insights, and really appreciate it. I'll turn it back to you, Robert.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. A valuable and fascinating discussion, and really we've explored areas which I didn't think we would. And Richard, thank you very much for raising the game there. So on behalf of Resilience First and PwC and all the participants, I'd like to thank the chair and the speakers for their superb contributions today. It's been really fascinating. So it only leaves me to say, finally, please do join us for our next webinar, which is on the 10th of March, when we'll be looking at digital resilience, the growth of AI, quantum technology, and cloud computing. So if you're into that, please do join us. We hope this will be a live event, but we will see. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and stay safe, and goodbye. Thank you again.
Yeah. So thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.